G'day guys, Brock Layden here, and in today's video I wanted to talk about 3 things that Big 4 consultants can learn from the life and lessons of Steve Jobs. Now, it all started when I read this wonderful book here, if I can get it in the light, right, there we go. It's a biography of Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. Now, it's a thick boy, as you can see. This book was the third or fourth biography that I read when I last year started to go down a biography kind of rabbit hole. And to be honest, the biographies that I read before it, they really felt like a chore to get through, and it took a lot of conscious effort and pushing and kind of grinding to get through them, because they were all kind of similar size. They're all written by Walter Isaacson as well. And yeah, anyway, they felt like a push to get through. But this biography was the first one that I read that I really fell in love with. So I'm keen to talk about it today. The other thing that I found interesting about the fact that I fell in love with this biography was the fact that I've never been an Apple guy. I've never been an Apple fanboy. I've always been the Android guy, like taking the piss out of Apple. But when I read this book, it gave me a much greater appreciation for like why Apple does things the way that they do. Now, they take a very different approach to like the likes of Google and Android. But it gave me, at least, even if their products weren't for me, I at least gained an appreciation for, why they do things and how they, came out of the principles that Steve Jobs himself had. I also read this book. I can't remember if that was early this year or late last year, but it's called Make Something Wonderful, Steve Jobs in his own words. And it's actually a free book you can get online. And legally, not illegally, but because it's put together by the Steve Jobs Archive, which I believe is, run by Steve Jobs' family. And it's a compilation of Steve's speeches that he gave, like magazine articles that he was interviewed for, and also his emails that he wrote. So the Steve Jobs Archive has access to, all the emails that he used to send. And so there's snippets there from emails throughout the years. And it was a very fascinating read. And anyway, so when I went down the rabbit hole of Steve Jobs, I read those 2 books, listened to like podcasts that he was on, not that there were many, but listened to interviews and that sort of thing, and really tried to dive deep on his philosophies. And when I was thinking about making this video, I was reflecting on what are the things that I really learnt from Steve Jobs, what are the key things that I've taken away from learning about him. And they kind of fell into 2 buckets. One bucket was leadership and Steve's leadership style and his principles, which were often very divisive. People either seemed to love Steve or couldn't stand him. But then there were also just his principles that related more to just how you do things, how you get work done. And so the focus of this video isn't going to be on his leadership style. I want to make this video really the same as the videos that have come before, more focused for Big 4 consultants who are trying to forge a career and make their way, and may not, be leaders on paper yet, but are at that, kind of graduate consultant, senior consultant level, who want to, climb the ranks and build a career in consulting. So that's what the focus of this video is going to be on. So, like I said, 3 things that I think Big 4 consultants can take from the life of Steve Jobs. Number 1 is attention to detail. So when Steve Jobs was a kid, his father Paul Jobs instilled in him this principle around the details matter. It's kind of like when people say the cliche, how you do anything is how you do everything. And Paul Jobs was, a bit of a handyman in the house. He's your typical, bloke at that time who, fix the fence in the house or could fix anything that was broken. Not like, people like me in my generation these days. And one of the things that he did was he got Steve involved in his handiwork. So Steve Jobs was, liked playing around with things, learning how to make things. And so his dad really leaned into that and gave him his own workbench in the garage, and he said, "Steve, this is your workbench now. Treat it, as you will." And one day, Paul and Steve Jobs were making a cabinet. I think it was for their own home, and they made this beautiful cabinet. But the thing that stood out to Steve was the fact that his dad, Paul, insisted that the back of the cabinet had to be made just as beautiful as everything else. And so Steve, as a kid, was kind of like, but no one's going to see the back of the cabinet anyway. It's the bit that nobody sees. And his dad basically said to him, no, but like, you're right, but it still needs to look beautiful, right? Because that's how you create art. When you're creating art, you're not just trying to do the bare minimum that people will see. You want to make the whole thing itself really beautiful. And so the back had to be, beautiful. And Steve took that, like when he grew up and built, Apple, he took that principle and really ran with it. So early days of the like Macs that Apple were building, I don't know if it's still the case today, but Steve used to insist that even though they actually specifically made, all the Apple devices that you couldn't open them because they didn't want people fiddling with the insides and that sort of thing. But even though they tried to lock them down, Steve still insisted that the insides had to look just as beautiful as the outside, which like frustrated engineers there and frustrated executives there, because from an economic perspective, it makes no sense. It's going to take more time to do the insides. Why am I wasting my time trying to make this beautiful when no one's going to see it? But to Steve, the details matter. It's all about attention to detail. You got to have pride in your work. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. You got to have pride in your work. Show that attention to detail. There was another example from Steve's life where I can't remember which computer it was. It was one of the early, Macs that they were creating, and Steve wanted. It was around the time, like it was the early days of computers, right? And so people were kind of cautious about technology and a bit concerned about it. People didn't necessarily trust them, and they were a bit worried about them. So Steve Jobs wanted to make them feel more human and friendly. And so one of the ways he wanted to do that was by introducing color. So on these computers, they had all these, you could get the computer in all these wonderful different colors. I think this was in the 80s, maybe the very early 90s. So it's like very different for its time to have colors on the computers. And when he was trying to figure out what colors to make them, he was thinking about where he could, who should he learn from to make the colors look beautiful and attractive. And he ended up going to a jelly bean company, going to their factory to see how they chose the colors of jelly beans. Because Steve was like, well, jelly beans look very delicious and attractive and enticing, and they're all these different colors. I want to go learn from them. And I think that's a great example of that level of attention to detail, where Steve Jobs is literally the founder of Apple. He's got so many things to worry about, and yet he's spending his day at a jelly bean factory because he wants to make sure that the colors that they make for these new computers are like perfect. He's not going to go get some consulting firm to give him 5 colors. He wants to go to a jelly bean factory himself and see it at the source. And I think those are two stories that kind of epitomize Steve Jobs' attention to detail. The fact that his dad taught him the back of the cabinet had to be beautiful, and so Steve Jobs made the inside of the Apple devices beautiful, even though nobody would see them. And then going to a jelly bean factory to find the perfect colors for his computers. So he really cared about the details. And I think from a consulting perspective, the lesson is very applicable as well. I spoke about this in my first video when I was talking about the paradigms a paradigm that can make Big Four consultants very successful. And it's all about, when you join as a graduate, the work that you are given is probably not going to be the most exciting or sexy stuff. And it can be very easy for you to look at that work and think that it doesn't really matter, or that it just, it's whatever. But the truth of it is that if you take pride in that work and doing that work really well, whether it's formatting a deck or populating a spreadsheet or whatever it might be, you do that work well and you take pride in it, even though nobody sees the back of the cabinet, even though this work might not seem that important, you do it anyway really well. That is how you get the attention of managers and directors above you, so that they will then give you more and more responsibility and you can take on more and more important work. You got to do the simple things well first, really well, and then you get trusted with greater and greater levels of responsibility. And for me, I saw this on my first project as a graduate. I started off basically just doing the shitty jobs that nobody wanted to do. So I was updating Jira tickets. I can't remember the details because it's years ago now, but literally get a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet would tell me what updates I had to make on other people's Jira tickets. And I did that, and I'd have to like chase people up to update their Jira tickets, and I'd like make some reports that would pull, data out of Jira and that sort of thing. And none of it was particularly like sexy or exciting, and I was doing it because I was a grad, and that work just like found its way to the bottom basically. But I tried to do it really well. I wanted to do it really well. At the time, I wasn't really thinking about it big picture. I was just like, I just wanted innately to do it well. But because I did that well, later on in the project, a spot opened up for a more, let's say, like a more senior role, or a role with more responsibility. And I think part of the reason that I got I got given the opportunity to step into that role was because I'd shown that I could do the simple things well, and I had an attention to detail to do them well. So that's the first takeaway, I think, from the life of Steve Jobs for Big Four consultants: attention to detail, doing the tasks that you think don't matter, just doing them really well, because the people above you will notice. It's not hard to tell when you give work to a graduate or a consultant or whatever, and it's not hard to tell whether they have actually put some effort and love into it versus when they've just like done it off the side of their desk and they're not really into it, so they've just given you something half-baked. And I promise you, like, as a leader now, like, I see that, and I spoke about this in my last video, the Matthew effect. Who do you think I'm going to give the next opportunity to? The person who did that simple job really well, or the person who saw the job as like simple and therefore just did like a half-baked thing that was, good enough? So that's the first lesson, attention to detail. The second one that I wanted to talk about is simplicity. And so as I'm recording this, just yesterday, I went to the Leonardo da Vinci exhibition in Melbourne, and it was unreal. And I'm definitely going to do a video like this, but on Leonardo da Vinci, so I don't want to talk about him too much now. But the very first quote when I walked into this exhibition, they had quotes all over the walls that you could see. And the first quote was actually a quote from Steve Jobs, and it was him talking about Leonardo da Vinci. And Steve Jobs was a big fan of Da Vinci. He took a lot of inspiration from him. And one of the ideas that he took from Da Vinci was the idea of simplicity. There's a quote that's attributed to Da Vinci, although I believe there is some kind of conjecture about whether he actually said it or not, but it's attributed to Da Vinci. And he said that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And that was a quote that Steve Jobs had, I think, like on a brochure in his office in the early days or something. It was a quote that he really, that resonated with him. He was a big believer in, simplicity being the ultimate sophistication. And he did this in a few different ways. And just quickly as well, why is simplicity the ultimate sophistication? Simplicity is hard to achieve. When you're building computers like Steve Jobs was at Apple, or like, today building phones and iPads and that sort of thing, they are very complex. The engineering that goes into them, the technology, the research, they're extremely complex. And imagine like back in the 70s and 80s when Steve was trying to make computers, they were even more complex. And what's easy is to make a complex product and for it to be complex. What's really hard is to make a complex product and to make it simple for somebody to use. And that's like one of the trademarks of Apple these days, right? Kind of what they've always prided themselves on is it being, their products being easy to use. And it came all back from, Steve Jobs' inspiration from Leonardo da Vinci about simplicity being the ultimate sophistication. So a few actual like ways that he did that. One is, the design of Apple products. So like I said, they're all designed to be intuitive to use, which again is kind of a miracle, because when you think about what's actually going on within a computer, most people wouldn't even understand what's actually happening behind the scenes when they move a mouse, click a button, type a button on a keyboard. All the complexity of how that operates is hidden from you behind the scenes, which takes a lot of effort to build something that way, right? Another example of Steve Jobs' approach to simplicity was, so at one point he So, I mean, many people don't know this, but he actually got kicked out of Apple at one point. He got like fired basically. And when he came back, he ends up coming back as CEO. He looked at Apple's product line and basically saw there were so many products that they were trying to sell. I can't remember the exact number, but I think it was like upwards of 20 different products. And he was sitting in a product meeting one day, and he was having these people try to explain to him all the different products that Apple was selling. Like in this meeting, even like before that meeting, he was like spending all this time with people in the company trying to be like, what do we sell? What are all these different products? And he basically got fed up because he couldn't figure out what the hell Apple was selling. What were the differences between all the products? And in this product meeting one day, he just yelled like, stop, stop, stop. And he got up on a whiteboard and he drew a very simple diagram. And I'll show you what he drew. So he drew something like this. He drew 4 quadrants and he said, all we need to do is make 4 products. We need to make a desktop device for consumers. We need to make a desktop product for pros. It's like power users and businesses. Then we need a portable product for consumers and a portable product for pros and business users. And that is all we need. Now, when Steve did that and he basically mandated we're going to cut so much of the product line, he ended up cutting 70% of Apple's product line, which is not an easy thing to do. You can imagine all these different products have sprouted out to meet different needs for different populations and that sort of thing. They weren't just created for no reason. They were created in response to something, right? There was a perceived need. And Steve Jobs basically said, no, we've got to simplify this. There's way too much going on. If I'm a customer and I want to buy Apple, I need to be able to look and see 4 products and figure out which one's the right one for me. And that's a very complex thing to do. How do you take a product line and reduce it by 70% without losing any of the quality? And that was what he set his people out to do, and that's what they ended up doing. Now, these days, is Apple growing out their product line again? Potentially you can make the case for that. But that was one example of Steve Jobs living out simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. You want to make things simple for your customers as much as possible. And even like the other way that was kind of shown by Apple, like the other way that they demonstrated that principle was, it's like I said at the start, I've always been like an Android guy. And I remember for so many years, hanging shit on people who would use Apple, saying things like, oh, you can't even customize this, or I can do this on my Android, or some feature would get released for Apple and you'd be like, wow, my Android's had that for 5 years or whatever. But that was actually the whole thing for Apple. They purposefully limited customization, because when you add customization, you add complexity. You can imagine being somebody who just wants to use a phone. You're not worried about trying to be a power user and change all these settings. You just want a phone that you can use and scroll Instagram on and go to YouTube on and that sort of thing. So they hid all the complexity, avoided all the customization, and just gave a product that like worked really well at what it was meant to do. So, and then what's the equivalent for that from a consulting perspective? I think one of the biggest differences between a good consultant and a bad consultant, and I've been both of these, is how well you can synthesize complex things. So I think like one of the core roles of a consultant, obviously there's all different types of consulting that you do, but across the board, at a high level, what you're doing is you're going into an organization, a client, there is some problem to be solved for, and presumably there's a lot of complexity in that problem. Otherwise, the client would have solved it themselves, right? They don't want to spend all the money to bring a big 4 firm in, but eventually it comes to a point where they realize, all right, we need to call some outside, support, some outside expertise into this. You're taking something that's very complex, and then as a consultant, you have to go in there, understand the problem, understand the client and their context, figure out why the problem is occurring, and then figure out some potential options or solutions to it. And then the key thing is you've got to play that back to a client, either through like a written report or perhaps it's a presentation or something like that. And one of the hardest things to do is to take all that work that you've done looking at you've been writing the details, looking at all these complex things, doing all this research, and then you've got to distill it and present it in a format that somebody who hasn't done all that work can understand. Now, the easy way to do it is to make a report or a presentation where you take them through every single thing that you had to learn, and try to get them to learn in 1 hour what you spent 8 weeks learning, which quickly leaves people confused because it's hard to follow, right? They weren't the ones who were there in the detail with you. They want to know what the answer is. What are the key findings? What's the outcome? And I think what a really good consultant can do is they can take all the chaos of everything that they were looking at, all the crossed paths, all the dependencies, all the complexity, and then they can take it up a layer and go, all right, here are the 3 things that you need to know, or here's the summary of everything that came below. And then obviously if a client wants to get into the details, then a good consultant can speak to that and can talk them through that. But I think a good consultant is good at taking something complex and presenting it to an audience and have them understand it. A bad consultant can have all the right answers, can have done all the work, done all the research, have the right answers, but then the way they present it is too complicated and people can't follow. And like I said, I've done both. I've done presentations that I was very proud of, where I'd spend a lot of time researching something and then presented it in a format that was a synthesized view that was easy to understand for an outsider. And then I've also been on the other side where I've done something complex, but then the way that I play it back to a client, and for what it's worth, I keep saying client, but especially when you're a graduate, you might be playing it back to the manager in your team or something like that, right? Before it then goes to a client. Anyway, like I was saying, I've done the other side of the spectrum where I've taken on something very complex, and then the way that I presented it back has been just as complex. And for me, the times that I have played something back very complex, like presented something in a way that was complex, are the times that I didn't truly understand what it was that I was talking about. Like, I might have understood what I was talking about, but I hadn't mastered it yet, put it that way. Like, I might have done all this research and I could tell you about that research, but I hadn't mastered it yet. Because if I'd mastered it, I'd be able to synthesize it to the few key points. It's like, one of the ways that you can tell whether someone really understands something is, can they explain it to a 5-year-old? Because I think when you have to explain something to a 5-year-old, you have to, again, take something very complex and distill it to its most simple parts and explain it in a way that people understand. If you don't understand that thing well enough, you're just going to regurgitate the same words that were fed to you that you might have read or heard or whatever. But when you understand something, you can take in all that research and then spit it out in a way that makes sense for the person that you're talking to, whether it's a 5-year-old or whether it's a CEO or something. And I think one of the biggest traps consultants can fall into is being like, oh, the client didn't understand this, or they don't understand that. Like, I can't believe they don't follow. Fundamentally, I think the job of a consultant is to take something complex, master it, figure it out, and then play it back in a way that is synthesized, summarized, and easy to understand. And then when someone wants to jump down the layers into the detail, they can do that too. But you don't start that way. You start high level, and then you drop down in the details when you need to. So as a graduate, consultant, senior consultant, whatever it is, what you can do is you can challenge yourself in terms of when you're writing a report or you're creating a presentation, whatever it might be, is it simple? Does it flow well? Are there 3 key points that you're getting across? Or are you going from here down to there, back up to there, backwards there? Or does it have a nice logical flow? You can see it at a high level. Because if it's not like that, challenge yourself on why. Because from my own experience, when I haven't been able to do that, it's because I've had a surface level understanding of the thing that I'm talking about or writing about. When I actually master what it is that I'm talking about, have a thorough understanding of it, I can tailor the message that it makes sense. I can synthesize it. So that's the second lesson I took from Steve Jobs. Credit to Leonardo da Vinci as well. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Now, the third and final one that I wanted to talk about is failure. So, Steve Jobs, obviously an extremely successful guy. You need not look further than like the back pocket of people's jeans these days, and see what do they have in there. Probably an iPhone most of the time. But he still had so much failure in his life, and I'm probably going to talk about this a lot on this channel. I don't know yet, but if I had to guess, I'm probably going to talk about failure a lot, because every single time I read a biography of guys like Steve Jobs and whoever else, like the common thread in all their stories is just how much they failed. But people don't talk about that as much because it's not the sexy highlight of somebody's life. But the reality is that these people all had so many failures. Anyway, two in particular that I want to talk about was Steve Jobs. I mentioned it earlier. A lot of people don't realize that, at least of my generation, I feel like people don't realize at least that Steve Jobs was actually booted out of Apple. So Steve Jobs built Apple, created it, built it up and up and up. And then I think it was in the 80s, like mid to late 80s. I could be wrong on that. He'd been running it for 15 years or so. Maybe closer to 10 years. He got kicked out of his own company. And I'm not going to go into the detail of why and how in this video. But this is a guy who built this company in his dad's garage, built it up to this massive thing, making millions of dollars, and then he got kicked out. And you can imagine, for an entrepreneur, that's almost like the biggest failure you could have, to grow your own business and then be kicked out of it by other people who didn't create it. And he spoke about how much that hurt him and the difference that it made in his life. So he went on to then go and create another tech company called Next, which was more focused on bringing technology to, I think it was higher education. But he openly spoke about how he needed to get kicked out of Apple. And while it was I think he described it as basically the most painful thing he'd ever experienced, but the lessons that he got out of it were so far more valuable than the pain that he had to experience. And ultimately what happens when you zoom out, he ends up coming back to Apple. He becomes the top dog there again because the company starts struggling, so they bring him back. And he does things like cut the product line, brings innovation back to the core. And from that point onwards, you've got the iPod, iTunes, the iPhone, the iPad, and it's just the rest is history. But a lot of it, who knows how much of that we would have today if Steve Jobs didn't get kicked out in the first place. Or maybe some other company would have done it first at a later point. Now, the other example of failure as well in Steve Jobs' life was, again, this is something else that I didn't know before I started reading about Steve Jobs, but he's actually the co-founder of Pixar, which I had no idea about. And I don't know, it just blew my mind when I read it. I'm like, why aren't more people talking about this? I guess it's perhaps not really that interesting, but so he was the co-founder of Pixar. He bought what would become Pixar when, I think the story basically goes, so Pixar was originally it wasn't called Pixar, but it was basically the technology department of Lucasfilms, owned by George Lucas. So George Lucas was a big believer in the fact that technology was going to drive movies in the future. But then I think the story basically goes, he went through a really messy divorce and had to liquidate a lot of his assets. And so he ended up selling basically the technology department of Lucasfilms. So he didn't sell Lucasfilms, but he sold the technology component of it. And Steve Jobs came in and bought it. And so I think Steve Jobs was really interested in the technology that they were building out to make films, especially animated films. And at that point in time, nobody was making full-length computer animated films. But Steve Jobs and the other co-founder, Ed Catmull, both kind of had this vision that one day that would be the future. You'd be making animated films and they would be generated on computers. Now, so where's the failure? The failure is in the fact that it was for basically, I think, like the first 10 years that Steve Jobs owned Pixar, it just bled money. And obviously Steve Jobs had already paid like tens of millions of dollars to buy Pixar in the first place. And I think he basically ended up putting in the same amount again over the years to continuously fund it. So the staff at Pixar kept having to come back to Steve and be like, we need more money, we need more investment, we're not there yet. And Steve Jobs put so much of his own money into it, and at some points would have absolutely been questioning whether he was like throwing everything away. Like, what was he doing with all this money? Was he ever going to see it again? And so for a long time there, it looked like Pixar was going to be a failure. And then in, I believe it was 1997, Toy Story came out and everything changed. So Toy Story was the first ever computer animated full-length film. And from that day forward, Pixar has never looked back, right? Obviously, Toy Story 2, Toy Story 3, and you got like Monsters, Inc. and Cars and all these different movies. But the unsexy part of the story of Pixar today, obviously part of Disney and all this sort of thing, the unsexy part of their story was the 10 years of bleeding money that came before they had their breakthrough and never looked back. So why do I mention this? Because plain and simple, like you will fail. You will fail. You join Big Four Consulting, you will fail. You'll have moments where you will fail. And no matter what you do in life, you will fail as well. But it doesn't make your life a failure, or it doesn't make your consulting a failure. If you're not failing, I think that is a bigger problem than failing, because if you're not failing, then you're not testing yourself. You're not doing anything that's on the edge of your capability. You're just sticking in your comfort zone. And ultimately, I think that is the biggest failure that you could probably have. If you're not testing your capabilities and stretching beyond what you think is possible, I think that is what you would look back on later down in your life and see or perceive as the ultimate failure, as opposed to, failures in the moment, like giving a presentation that doesn't land like you hoped it would, or stepping up for a role and realizing you're not ready for it and really struggling and needing more support. Failure is just the price you pay for success. And I've had so many failures in my Big Four journey already. I actually went through a really interesting exercise about 4 or 5 weeks ago now, I think it was, maybe a little bit longer, where I wrote what I called my book of lowlights. And it's literally just a list of the dumbest, cringiest, most embarrassing mistakes and failures that I've had so far in my Big Four consulting career. And it was like really kind of hard and like painful is not the right word. Just like writing that list out was just gave me uncomfortable amounts of cringe, but it was kind of therapeutic as well to just like write it out and put it out there and kind of own it as part of my story. Like my story of where I am today and the career that I've had so far, what people on the outside wouldn't necessarily see as much, or like, don't get me wrong, there were definitely witnesses to some of these things, but I don't know, like when people look at my journey, probably what they wouldn't see or think about as much as all of the just like fuck ups that I've had along the way and all the mistakes that I've made. And I wrote that book of lowlights to be part of, I wanted to give it out to like graduates and consultants as part of the 8-week consulting challenge that I've built out, which I won't talk about now. I'll touch on it at the end. But like, I just want to put it out there that you are going to fail. It's okay. I have failed so much. I'd actually like to think that I have had more failures than the average consultant. And I'd actually be quite proud of that, because I think it's because, not that I am like useless or something like that, but it's because I've always tried to, not always, but I have generally tried to step outside my comfort zone and do something that I wasn't comfortable with to test myself. And I say not always, because I've definitely had moments where I've had the chance to step up and I've stepped back because I've been too nervous about it. And I think that is ironically the failure. It's not when you step up and fail. I think the failure is when you don't step up in the first place. But if you're not going to see, my book of lowlights, you're not, joining the 8-week challenge, I wanted to share two just like, quick stories about failure in my own journey. One was like the first time, and to be fair, really the only time that I've been like properly yelled at work. I had an experience last year where, long story short, I essentially didn't get a report out to a certain stakeholder in as timely a manner as they would have liked. It feels like a very watered down way of like trying to put it, but that's essentially what happened. And the failure on my part was kind of on two parts. One was the fact that I didn't get this report out on time. The second was that I didn't even realize it wasn't on time. So there's a fundamental difference in expectations, I suppose. I didn't realize the expectations this particular stakeholder had, that like, one, they wanted it by this certain time, and two, that it was really important that they had it by this time. So what ended up happening was I didn't get the report out on time, and I didn't realize that it was I didn't realize I didn't have it out on time, and I also didn't realize that it was a big deal that I didn't have it out on time. So when I got confronted about it by this person, I was pretty lackadaisical about it. I didn't see what the big deal was, which, when you've just made a mistake, which to somebody is an important mistake, the last thing you want to do is be lackadaisical and nonchalant about it, right? And I was naive. I didn't mean to do this. I just literally didn't realize, and that was the mistake that I made. I didn't set clear expectations, and I just got plain and simple yelled at, and that's fine, because I needed to be woken up. I needed a wake up call, right? Obviously not everyone's going to respond positively to that, and if you're a leader, it's probably not wise to go around yelling at everybody. But this particular stakeholder knew me quite well, knew me really well, and probably knew that I could take it and I'd be fine with it. And it was so strange. The rest of that day, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe what just... I'm smiling about it now, but I promise you, at the time, I was not smiling about it. I was kind of like, what the hell have I just done? But that experience taught me so much about being on my high horse, being overconfident, being lackadaisical and nonchalant. And ever since then, I am so much more careful about just the way that I carry myself, and about deadlines, and ensuring that expectations are aligned, that I understand the importance of something to somebody else that's relying on me, because I never want that to happen again. So that was one. The other one that I quickly wanted to touch on was my journey to the Big Four consulting firms. Started out obviously with grad applications, as it would for any grad, and I got rejected by 3 out of the 4 consulting firms. And I would be lying if I said that wasn't something that I thought about every now and then. It's not like I go to bed and wake up every morning thinking about it, but I'd say once every couple of weeks, I think back to the fact that 3 out of the 4 firms, in essence, said that they didn't want me. And that was kind of like a rejection in my journey before my journey had even started, right? It's like I hadn't even gotten in the door yet. I was already getting rejected by 75% of the big four firms. But I'm actually really grateful that I got rejected by three of them. Because like I said, I'd be lying if I said that hadn't given fuel to my fire. I've definitely been motivated at different points in my career to want to like prove people wrong and to achieve great heights because of those initial rejections. Not that I think that those three firms even know who I am or are thinking about me at all. It's not about that. But I was definitely motivated by the fact that I was rejected at the start and I wanted to like prove people wrong and to try and be a really successful consultant. So, like I said, I wouldn't take that back. I love the fact that I got rejected now because it put that fire in my belly to want to go and like do really great things. So I wouldn't trade that failure for anything. And I think that's the best way you can look at failure, to be able to look back on failures that you've had and actually be grateful for them and not want to trade them for anything because they're part of your journey and they're part of what made you who you are today. And if you are open-minded and take the time to truly reflect on them, I think there is so much that you can learn from all of them, which isn't anything new, right? Like I totally get that's such a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. And if you're starting a career in the big four firms, I think you need to be ready to fail. And if you're not failing, I think you should be asking yourself why. Are you getting outside your comfort zone enough? Because ultimately getting outside your comfort zone and doing those sorts of things that are out of the normal for people at your level, like, you know, your colleagues and whatnot, your peers, is how you differentiate yourself. It's how you learn faster than everyone else by failing more than them. It's how you do greater things and differentiate yourself so that come year-end review time, you stand out. And I think it's the key to having a journey where you ultimately look back and don't have regrets. I think the biggest regrets people have are when they didn't do things. It's not when they did things and sucked at them, it's just when they didn't do the things. So embrace failure. Like I said, Steve Jobs, one of the most successful, entrepreneurs, business builders of all time, failed in two of his businesses. Failed in the short term, but in the long term was wildly successful because of those failures at Apple and Pixar. So those are the three lessons that I wanted to talk about from the life of Steve Jobs. So attention to detail, doing the little things really well, the back of the cabinet that nobody sees, making it beautiful, doing the shitty tasks that you get at the start really well. And that links well to the first video about the paradigms of successful consultants. If you haven't watched that and you want to see that for more of a deep dive. Second idea was simplicity. So realizing that the ultimate sophistication is simplicity, trying to take complex things, understand them so well that you can synthesize them and play them back in a very simple format, like explain it to a 5-year-old. And then failure, recognizing that everybody fails. And if you're not failing, it's probably because you're not stepping outside your comfort zone and you're not going to achieve your full potential, which is probably the greatest failure that you could have. So those are the three things. I hope you've gotten something out of today's video. Would love to hear any comments that you have, so feel free to chuck them down below. Looks like I'm giving a thumbs down. I'm not giving a thumbs down. Put them down below. Love to hear your thoughts, whether you agree, disagree. I love the comments that have been coming through and the messages that I've been receiving. I'm trying to respond to all of them, so please reach out. I'd love to hear people's thoughts. Subscribe as well. If you want to keep seeing this content, I'm planning on doing these videos once a week, every week. So subscribe and you can get them in your feed. You can hit the notification bell as well, so you get a notification when these videos go up. And also, just a final call out, if you are a Big Four consultant, so building your career in the Big Four firms, when you're a graduate consultant, senior consultant, and if you want an extra resource, which is easy to use, that can help you, I've created an 8-week challenge that you can join You can join via the link in the description. You put your email in, and every week on a Monday morning, you'll get an email from me around a certain topic that I've found valuable in building out my own career. And I'll give you an explanation of why it's been important, how it's been part of my journey. And then I'll give you an implementation checklist of actions that you can take during the week to apply those lessons for yourself. So you're not just reading, but you're reading and doing. Unless it's 8 weeks, join at any time. The link will be in the description below. But that's all for this week, guys. Appreciate it, and I'll see you next week.